How did the universe come to be? The easiest way to find the answer, likely, would be to ask someone or something that was there at the very start. Our story begins with one such girl. Perhaps she was created at the world's genesis, or perhaps she was the one who created our universe to begin with. The only thing we know for certain is that she has existed for as long as time itself. For millions and billions of years, she simply observed as rock and volcanic waste slowly cooled and life began to take root in the world. She didn't think, per se, because what even was consciousness to begin with? Eventually, though, sapiens did take root in the world. Life forms began to gain knowledge with time and theory, and so too did the girl slowly become self-aware. She watched the world and its creatures as man slowly took shape into the species we know today. The girl never understood what she was or why. In her desperate struggle to understand herself, she began to take after the life she saw around her. First, she became like the snakes that slithered in her cave. And as she came to know the visage and brutality of man, so too did she inherit their stature. However, while the girl was like a man, like a snake, she was not either. Humans shunned her. The animals couldn't understand her pleas for help. And so she found herself alone, left forever to ponder what she was to begin with, and where in the world she belonged. Time passed and the girl went out into the world of man. Time and time again she sought understanding, and time again she was met with brutality and vice. Thousands of years she attempted to understand, all for naught. Eventually, the girl decided that whatever she was not a human, for the humans constantly rejected her, and, tired as she was, she finally gave up. The girl retreated into the woods, where she planned to live out the rest of her days in solitude. That, however, was not what occurred. While the girl was searching for herself, a young man from a rich family was drafted into one of man's many wars. He tried to fight, but was weak and, more importantly, looked remarkably strange. This man's name was Tsukihime, an albino with pale skin and hair. He stuck out from his fellow humans, and so, as many things are, he was rejected. Tsukihime left the battlefield, ashamed that he was so different. On his way back to his home in the country, he cut through a forest and happened upon something that changed him forever. There he saw a strange girl, with scales peppered on her skin and long, beautiful black hair. She sat alone in the forest, looking rather upset, and the sight completely and utterly stole Tsukihime's heart. He introduced himself to the girl who had decided to cut herself off from humans, and so did our story begin, with simply a boy meeting a girl. Over the next year, Tsukihime would build the girl a home in the forest where she wouldn't need to fear the humans, and in that time, the two of them would slowly grow closer. Tsukihime was a kind man who constantly doted on the somewhat selfish but ever-cute girl, while she, for her part, didn't understand feelings of love or affection, but nonetheless found her heart being swayed by the strange, kind man. Eventually, their home was finished. What was supposed to be a chance encounter turned into a lifelong bond, and Tsukihime moved into that forest home with the girl. Outside their house, a lone thistle flower bloomed. There was something about it that the man found very beautiful and very reminiscent of a certain standoffish girl. While the girl was not a human and needed to abide by their customs, nonetheless, Tsukihime proposed giving her a name. Thinking on that thistle, blooming beautifully all alone, Tsukihime decided that the girl, his new wife, would henceforth be named Azami. For two people who never truly had a place in the world, a girl who was immortal and different, and a boy who was born defective, that home became their salvation. Over time, Tsukihime and Azami had a daughter of their own, a little girl named Shion, and the three of them, at last, discovered what true happiness was. That said, time is a force that cannot be slowed or stopped. Azami had lived ever since life could be defined, and would likely continue to live far into the ends of the universe. But Tsukihime was only a man. Even their daughter, who carried half of Azami's genes, would one day succumb to the very human aspect of her mortality. While Azami had lived for billions of years, she had never grown close enough to anything to know the feeling of grief, and the idea that one day her family, her husband, her daughter, might leave her all alone again terrified Azami more than anything else in the world. And so, she decided to change it. Azami was, in many ways, not like a normal human. In addition to the scales on her face and the seemingly infinite nature of her life, she could synthesize for herself many abilities that humans didn't have. In a desire to understand, she could peer into the minds and hearts of people animals, and all manner of life. When she needed to leave it all, she could erase her presence from the detection of others. Azami had a large host of these powers that she had created for herself over the many, many years of her existence. Most recently, she had created an ability to directly convey her feelings to another without words, a tool so she could tell her infant daughter that she loved her, while she could not yet understand speech. Azami had many strange and fantastic powers, and so, deep within her heart, she sought an answer to the problem of finite time. That was when the snake of clearing eyes first spoke to her. Azami didn't simply create powers, she created beings within herself that had their own level of sapience. In her desire to stop the hands of time, Azami created one such being that took the form, as many other elements of herself did, of a snake. This snake proposed a solution to Azami's grand problem. Just as it was possible that Azami created the universe to begin with, the snake of clearing eyes proposed that Azami simply create a new world entirely. In this world, time would not flow, and all life would be eternal. There, she could retreat with Tsukihime and Shion, and there, the three of them could be happy forever. She proposed this idea to her husband, who saw the desperation in her eyes and the fear in her heart, and agreed to leave the world behind. The day they'd leave would be the 15th of August, the holiday made for greeting the dead. There was just one thing that the albino man wanted before they would all leave. He wished to formally marry Azami, and went to town to retrieve the wedding dress that was passed down his family for generations. Tsukihime left the forest for the last time, to say a final goodbye to that sad and broken world. However, before he would return, a mob would discover Tsukihime and find their way to the monster that he housed in the woods. Humanity never changed, still rejecting that which they found different, just as they always had. An angry mob attacked Shion and Azami, trying to kill the monsters, and Azami was just barely able to fight them off, protecting her daughter. Tsukihime was nowhere to be seen, his safety and whereabouts unknown. This event was the final straw that broke Azami at last. Why did such a horrible thing occur? Why had the home built by her husband been desecrated? Why did her daughter need to live in perpetual fear her entire life? The answer was simple. Everything was her fault. It was Azami that was the constant force endangering the lives of her husband and daughter. Without Azami, they could surely live a normal life, or at least a life in which they didn't need to constantly live in fear. Everything was Azami's fault. It was always Azami's fault. And so, defeated, Azami made a choice. Using the power within her, she left for the world she created, that timeless field. Except unlike their plan, she left alone. What Shion and Tsukihime needed wasn't a world without time. They needed a world without Azami, and so she left it all behind. Tsukihime returned just in time to find their daughter alone and Azami hurriedly leaving the world. Never again would she return to him. This was the first tragedy, the event that would set in motion all of the events to come. In truth, Azami was just a little girl, hardly more worldly or mature than her daughter. She lived alone and put up barriers, and so she didn't know what to do or how to live with herself when those barriers broke. And so she retreated into that endless world, never to leave again. The world had no need for Azami Kosakura. It never did. That, of course, was not true at all. Tsukihime and Shion continued to live in that house, the house in which they were family. Though there was a tangible absence, never once did they blame Azami for what she did. Shion remembered her mother's love, that real, undeniable love that was given to her by Azami's powers, and Tsukihime continued to love his wife, the girl who saved him when he thought he himself was worthless, until the day he died. Many years passed. Tsukihime felt like any other human, but to the end was always loved by his daughter, who never left his side. In time, Shion met a human herself and had a daughter named Mary, but time was ruthless, and her husband left the world as well. In the end, Shion was left to raise Mary alone. Shion was a kind and loving mother. She was raised by her father, the endlessly kind Tsukihime, and though their time together was short, she never forgot the love of her mother either. That said, Shion was a terrified girl. She knew that the outside world tried and desired to kill her. She knew that the humans scared off her mother and left her alone. Even after meeting a good person and having her own daughter, Mary, Shion was eternally untrusting of the human world, and so kept Mary at home, never permitting her to stray too far from the home that her father had built. Mary, though, was a curious child. Unlike Azami, who had only ever known pain and fear, Mary only knew love. She desired the world and never understood what could possibly be so vile about it. And so, one day, she strayed away from their home in the woods on a hazy August 15th. Shion only realized her daughter was in danger when she heard the screams. Mary had been found by a group of humans who immediately tried to kill the strange-looking girl. Shion rushed to her daughter's aid and fought back, but ultimately sustained horrid injuries as well. Both mother and daughter were beaten and dying, once again at the hands of the humans. There was an observer to this chaos. While she had left behind the world of the living, Azami continued to occasionally monitor the lives of her family from the other world. She saw the brutalization of her daughter she abandoned and the granddaughter she never knew, and was mortified. For all of her mistakes, Shion and Mary were still endangered, still othered by the humans around them. That's when a voice called out to her. The same voice that called out and proposed that Azami escape the world to begin with. The snake of clearing eyes spoke within Azami. "Oh, my master, what a horrible tragedy. But perhaps you could change this future." Desperate to save the life of her daughter and granddaughter, Azami commanded the everlasting world to consume the dying girls, and consume them it did. Within Azami's world, their wounds wouldn't kill them, for death didn't exist there. That said, Azami had grown disillusioned with eternity in the years since losing her family. While she certainly agreed that the world would be better off without her, she also realized that living in her world without the joys of the normal world was torture, and so she wished to send her daughter back. Her wounds, though, were too severe for her to live through them. But the Snake of Clearing Eyes offered its wisdom once again. If Shion wasn't able to live on her own life, Azami should just provide her a new one. Her many powers to change the world. Her snakes. If Azami were to give up her strongest snake to her beloved daughter, surely that would suffice to keep her living. And so Azami, persuaded once more by the Clearing Eyes, did just that. From deep within herself, she produced the Queen Snake, her strongest power which governed all of the others, and gifted it to Shion in hopes that she could leave the eternal world and live once more. However, Shion saw things a different way. In the many years since she last saw her mother, she had grown into a mother herself. Rather than take her mother gift as her own, she passed the Queen Snake along to her own daughter, Mary. Taking the power of the Queen into herself, Mary left the eternal world and woke up alone back near her forest home, her mother gone from her life. Mary's memories of the other world were hazy and would dissipate over time. The only thing she knew for sure was that her curiosity had taken the most precious thing in her life away from her, and so she returned to her home, deciding to never leave it again. Shion and Azami remained trapped in the darkness. At the very least, Mary's life was saved, and all of the tragedy would be put to rest. That was what the children of the snakes believed. But the Clearing Eyes laughed to itself, knowing that once more, and for the last time, he had deceived the woman born from the beginning. Yes, Azami was tricked once more. Without the Queen Snake, her control center for her powers, she couldn't issue orders to the eternal world anymore, which meant that the world would continue to follow its last order for all of eternity. Every year, on August 15th, the dying would be swept up into the eternal world and presented with the opportunity to steal one of Azami's snakes to return to the world of the living. In order for this to be possible, they must have a strong wish that resonated with the reason that Azami created each of her powers to begin with. But if that condition was fulfilled, then anyone could arrive and steal one of Azami's snakes. Yes, even the Snake of Clearing Eyes itself. By the time Azami would realize this error, it was already too late. The Clearing Eyes tricked Azami in such a way that she would be trapped in that eternal world forever. But someday, as people kept dying, it would be able to trick a human soul into taking it back into the world of the living, where it could continue to live and prosper. The failings and loneliness of a single girl were about to involve countless more people than she ever would have imagined. Many years passed until the first usurper would arrive into the world of Azami's creation. Hirosubumi was an unfortunate girl. Her parents divorced, she was raised alone by her mother until she passed when Kiro was still a young girl. With nowhere else to go, she was taken into the care of her affluent father. Kiro was suddenly expected to be a high-class girl, under the supervision of a family she never knew. Her father kept his distance, and she was instead taken care of by her new sister, an older girl named Rin. The two had trouble connecting, and Rin's cold attitude only further isolated Kiro. That fragile sort of peace wouldn't last either. One day, Kiro would realize that the problems of the adults were well beyond her understanding, or ability to control. Her father had decided that he wanted to take Kiro and escape from his life, his wealth and the rest of their family be damned. Setting fire to the home, he killed their servants and pursued the young girl. Rin, the older sister Kiro never understood, hid Kiro and herself away in the basement, trying to escape from the madness. But it was only a matter of time until they were found, and Rin gave her life to try and protect Kido from her father's insanity. Kido watched Rin die in front of her. In truth, the cold sister always loved her younger family member, even if she never knew how to connect with her. In a fit of desperation, Kido grabbed a bottle and attacked her unknowing father. While this was enough to subdue him, nothing would bring Rin back to life or make up for the fact that Kido never accepted her love. Grasping the bleeding body of her sister, Kido was engulfed by the flames of their burning home, dying that day. However, on that cruel August 15th, Kido didn't go away. She and Rin were taken into the eternal world, just as Seto and Mary once were themselves. Azami's world takes shape around the hearts of everyone who enters it. For Kido and Rin, their eternal world was a maze of fire and death, haunting them for all eternity. Her sister, even after death, pushing her forward and guiding her through the tragedy, Kido's strong desires resonated for the first time with one of Azami's snakes. There was only one desire in the dying girl's heart. I want to disappear. If not for her, Rin never would have died. Indeed, everything all along was her fault, and so the only thing she wanted was to disappear. Kido resonated with and acquired the snake of concealing eyes, the ability to erase one's presence from the notice of others, and return to the rubble of her broken old home. 3 more unfortunate children would become the next inheritors of the snakes on August 15th. A young orphan boy named Seto was the unfortunate victim of bullying. His only friend was a dog, and knowing this, the boys captured said dog and threw it into a river to drown in front of Seto. However, Seto jumped in after the dog to try and save it, much to the surprise of the bullies. While valiant, his efforts were in vain, though, as both he and the animal he loved drowned in the current, the bullies fleeing the scene. There, Seto too entered Azami's world. Seto was, above all else, a kind boy. Even as he was mocked and picked on, the only thing he ever wanted was to understand. He wished to know why people hated him, thinking that if he knew such things, he could change himself. Yes, that was his strongest desire, and so when he was taken into Azami's world, his wish came true. Leaving the darkness, Seto returned to the world of the living with the snake of stealing eyes, which allowed him to read minds and see the thoughts of others. The third child was a boy named Kano Shuya. Kano was raised alone by his mother, who herself was an unfortunate and misguided soul. Kano was regularly beaten in his apartment, but even through the abuse, he couldn't bring himself to hate his mother. He would hide the bruises and wounds, and had become, even as a child, adept at lying to pretend that he was happy and everything was okay. Before Kano would ever get to understand his mother, their home would be broken into one night. It was a burglary, just simple bad luck. Kano and his mother were found in their home, and, in a fit of panic, they were both killed by the home invader and taken to the eternal world. Kano Shuya had a strong desire of his own, to protect his mother, to appear normal. Kano lied. He wanted to hide the scars and perform happiness. That's what he thought would bring him the best world. That wish granted, Kano returned to life with the snake of deceiving eyes, the ability to flawlessly alter how others perceive you. The last child to steal a snake had a fate no better than the rest. Kisaragi Momo was the second child of the Kisaragi home. Her older brother was a genius, a gifted child that received all the praise in the world in spite of his own rather cold and hopeless outlook. Momo, on the other hand, was just a normal girl. She couldn't stack up to her brother and was constantly compared to him as she grew up. That said, her brother held no ill feelings for Momo, and neither did she hate her brother. While the two siblings didn't exactly understand one another, they certainly cared for each other somewhere in their hearts. That was what brought Momo to the beach one day. Her brother, you see, wasn't able to swim, and so Momo decided that she would learn first. This wasn't out of a desire to be better than him. It was simply so that she could teach him, and the two could spend time together as siblings. Momo went to the beach with her father, eager to learn and form that bond with her brother someday. That wish, however, would never come to pass. Momo was too capricious and strayed too far from the shore, getting swept up in a strong current. Dashing after her, her father raced into the water, but in attempting to save his daughter, they both drowned in the sea and were swept up into the other world. Everything Momo did, she did for attention. Not a shallow praise, but simply for the time of day of the people that she loved. Momo did love her brother. She loved her family dearly. Even as she drowned, she prayed with all of her heart that someone would notice her and bring her back home. All she wanted was their approval and their love. And so that wish was granted. Momo took Azami's snake of drawing eyes and returned to the beach with the ability to force people's attention and affection on her. The Kisaragi household lost their father, and Momo's mother was left to raise her 2 children alone. The other 3 were not so fortunate. Kido and Kano lost any family they may have known in the past and were sent off to an orphanage in town. There, they, along with another young boy, Seto Kosuke, would become known as strange children who exhibited scary powers. The three kids weren't able to fully control their gifts from the eternal world. Seto would constantly hear the thoughts of others, overwhelming the young boy, and Kido would randomly seem to vanish from the room. Furthermore, when their powers were being activated, their eyes would turn red, the same color of Azami. This led to the three kids being grouped together and all but neglected by their orphanage. Kido, Kano, and Seto formed a steady alliance out of necessity. However, they didn't need to wait nearly as long as they anticipated to find a suitable home. A young couple, a pair of scientists, abruptly adopted the three children into their custody one day. Kenjiro and Ayaka Tateyama were two historians looking into the case of the so-called Medusa that once terrorized the world. Hearing about the three strange children, the couple immediately adopted them when they heard about their powers and verified that they were in fact relics of the Medusa, the one and only Azami Kozukura. In spite of their ulterior motives, Kenjiro and Ayaka were good people with all intentions to raise their children well. For the first time since their tragedies, Kido, Kano, and Seto had a new place to call home, and a new sibling who would dote on them endlessly. Slightly older than the trio, the Tateyama's daughter, Ayano, was a ray of hope. She was an energetic and kind girl who welcomed her new siblings with open arms. In spite of the children's rough histories, the kindness of the Tateyama family slowly broke down their walls. Still, wounds don't heal overnight. Seto had developed a crippling fear of others, constantly exposed to cruel and hateful thoughts people would never put to word. Kano had his own history of child abuse, and Kido had shut herself away in her shell. None of the children asked for their fates. None of them asked for the red eyes that set them apart from others. Which is why Ayano, their new sister, who had no connection to their history, wrote herself into their futures. After meeting her new siblings, the young girl began to wear a red scarf everywhere she went. While she may have lacked their eyes, she knew to adorn herself in the same color that made their siblings so different, and together they slowly but surely found happiness. Joining their hands as one, the siblings formed a secret pact together. The children took to wearing hoodies to hide their eyes until they could control them, and Ayano stood beside them boldly and beautifully in red. They would fight injustice and be as heroes under the name Mekakushidaan, the Blindfold Gang, hiding their eyes from the world. The Tateyama family, with its three new members, began to stabilize. The children were interesting and provided insights for Kenjiro and Ayaka into the nature of the Medusa, and the children found a new home and renewed sense of love in their parents and sister. Still though, things were often hard. No harder than for Seto Kosuke. By far, he exerted the least control over his eyes. As such, the boy would often stay at home in relative peace, or otherwise seek out the quietest places, if and when he ever needed to go out. One day when he was out of home, Seto was overwhelmed and couldn't take it anymore. He ran from the city, overwhelmed by cries, and into the nearby forest, anywhere to get away from the countless screaming voices in his skull. He ran and ran until at last, everything went quiet. Unfortunately, by that time, he had completely lost his way. Seto wandered the woods, first at random and then vaguely guided by the forest life, which he was able to communicate with to an extent thanks to his mind-reading power. Eventually, tired and weak, Seto heard a girl cry into the forest. Or rather, he perceived a girl calling out. He heard the thoughts of a girl crying for help, of a girl lamenting her state and her uselessness. While Seto was bad with strangers, something about what she said had struck a chord with him. She, of course, reminded him of himself. Someone so weak, in spite of having the love and kindness of so many people around him. Gathering all of his courage, Seto pursued the voice deeper into the woods. There, Seto saw something bizarre, right out of a picture book. Alone and forgotten in the middle of the woods was the home that Tsukihime had built for the girl he loved so many years ago. Seto approached the door and knocked, and, opening slowly, he found a little girl, Mary Kozukura, all alone, crying on the floor. Mary never forgot of her desire to see the world, but neither could she ever forget the pain and guilt that dream cost her. The knock on her door, the day and night would whisk her away and into a beautiful world, just like out of a story. That's what Mary always wanted, but reality had taught her to expect different. She cried on the floor, terrified of making the same mistakes again. Seto, of course, was hardly the same kind of person that killed her mother or chased away her grandmother. Rather than a fist, the young boy offered the crying girl the shake of a hand. For the first time since he died, Seto decided to be brave. He soothed the girl, offering her his jacket, passed down from his sister, and assured her that there was hope out there in the world. After all, for everything Seto had done and failed to do, Kano and Kido accepted him. Ayano loved him dearly. So how could the world possibly be an awful place? Could you take me to such a wonderful place? Yes. That was the story of how boy met girl, and the world would change forever. Together, Seto took Mary out of the woods and into the light for the first time in her life. Eventually, the two made it back to town, where Seto surprised the Tatayamas with a girl. One look at her and but a listen to her stories, and the Tatayama parents realized that Seto had, unknowingly, brought them closer to the truth of the Medusa than they ever could have imagined. The parents happily accepted Mary into the family just as they'd done with the trio before her. Ayano, naturally, was even more excited, happily welcoming Mary as the fourth member of the mekakushidaan, and, more importantly, her new sister. Much time passed as their home grew only more busy, but ever more happy. As Mary adjusted to the many new things in her life, Kenjiro and Ayaka planned out a journey back into the woods. With Mary, they wanted to investigate her old home for traces of Azami. Everything they'd been working for had finally paid off. Mary was happy to oblige her parents, and Ayano, excited by a field trip to Mary's house, insisted she tag along as well. Kido, Kano, and Seto stayed home while their parents, Ayano and Mary, decided to take a trip together on August 15th. With the coming of a Bon, though, tragedy would strike once more. Heavy rains had washed out the roads the day before, and as the family drove up through the mountains to the forest, their car was caught in a landslide. Mary was pinned in the rubble, but only suffered light injuries. However, Kenjiro, Ayaka, and Ayano weren't so lucky. All three original members of the Tatayama family died, entering the eternal world and leaving Mary all alone. However, this accident would bring with it the fifth usurper. Ayano Tatayama was a pure child. She only wished from the bottom of her heart to let her siblings, who were so hurt by the world, know her love. From the darkness, Ayano would claim the snake of favoring eyes from the everlasting world of Azami, the power to project one's thoughts and feelings onto others. That, however, was not all Ayano received. As Ayano claimed her snake, she was inundated with the thoughts and feelings of its previous owner. All at once, Azami's memories and feelings, billions, trillions, unknowable years of information flooded the girl's brain all at once, driving her psyche away and into madness. Ayano now understood exactly what was happening to her. She knew that the clearing eye snake had tricked Azami, that all of her siblings had been caught up into a mess far greater than they ever knew. She understood that everyone was in terrible danger, and that the queen snake, the start of everything, was in no one but the girl she welcomed as sister. Ayano returned to the world of the living, but Ayano Tatayama was no longer the same girl that she used to be. Mary crawled towards her sister, tears flowing from her eyes, as she realized that Kenjiro and Ayaka didn't make it. As she reached out to Ayano, though, her once loving sister battered away her hand. Of all of Azami's many memories, the most pervasive ones were fear and anger. She thought of all the times that man had betrayed Azami, the pain of losing Tsukihime, the fear of losing her daughter, and Ayano turned to Mary with cold and unforgiving eyes. Everything, Ayano concluded, was Mary's fault. The two made it back to their home, where they had to tell Kido, Kano, and Seto that their parents would never come back. As the children grieved, Ayano silenced the room by insisting that they get rid of Mary. Ayano had learned a great many things, but was still herself a child even so. She insisted that tragedy would only continue to follow them so long as Mary was allowed to be with them. But as she closed in on the terrified girl, Kido, Kano, and Seto rose to Mary's defense. They didn't know what had happened to their older sister, but they knew that Mary had done nothing wrong. They tried to reason with Ayano, who would never reach a compromise. And when the ultimatum was set that Ayano wouldn't stay with Mary, 3 children left alongside her, leaving their older sister alone in her once lively and warm home. The 4 kids would settle in an apartment, Seto dropping out of school and working as a laborer to pay rent. It would be years until the family would ever meet again. While Kido, Kano, Seto, and Mary were escaping the tormented Ayano, Kisaragi Momo had many developments herself. She too had trouble controlling her drawing eyes, which had been making people unknowingly attracted to her. Everything she did was considered fantastic, even if it was truly only average. For some reason, she was always the center of attention. Surely that kind of dazzling girl, which Momo in all reality was not, would naturally catch the eyes of certain recruiters. Momo's mother supported her and her brother alone, which Momo never stopped feeling guilt over. As such, she decided one day to take up an offer she received on the street and start working part-time as an idol. Naturally, this proposition was only brought about because of Momo's drawing eyes. But if she could in any way support the family that she had destroyed, she would try and do so. This popularity, though, was taxing on the girl who never truly wanted it, and invoked the ire of her brother, who swore to look after her. Momo's brother would often chase people away from their home, insisting that Momo step out of the public eye. But she would do what she had to help her family. Years passed and Momo's older brother graduated middle school, opting, however, to drop out and not continue on to high school. This wasn't because he was stupid, anything but. The boy was too smart. Momo's brother, Shintaro Kisaragi, was so disenfranchised with the school system and so suspicious of others because of everything he'd seen protecting his sister that he gave up on school and indeed most people entirely. Everything would change for both him and the Kisaragi family as a whole, though, when Shintaro would, in a pure accident, trip and break his foot. Shintaro's accident brought him to the hospital, where he would spend a short stay. There, he found himself rooming with another young man, albeit slightly older. Caught up with some illness or another, Shintaro met Haruka Kokonose, his first true friend. While Shintaro was a cold and bitter boy, Haruka was bright and cheery, innocent to a fault. He brushed off Shintaro's abrasiveness, and through his endless joy, the two formed a bond. Together, they would play video games on the handheld devices that Haruka had with him. In the quiet warmth of the hospital, the two found a very special connection. Shintaro was, however, not the first person to be touched by Haruka's kindness. Prior to Shintaro's arrival, Haruka, who was a long-term patient at the hospital, met by chance another temporary patient, a gloomy girl named Takane Enomoto. Takane suffered from narcolepsy and was briefly hospitalized after taking a fall in which her grandmother overreacted to. Takane had a bit of a difficult personality, not unlike Shintaro. But even so, Haruka's optimism warmed her over, and the two became friends. Much like the older Kisaragi sibling, but for entirely different reasons, Takane too had a general aversion to most people. Self-conscious of her disability, Takane spent most of her time indoors, sleeping and playing video games. In truth, it was she who introduced Haruka to video games in the first place. The handheld games a regular tradition that they would engage in whenever they met. To Haruka, Takane offered a carefree sort of normalcy that he lacked, living permanently at the hospital. And to Takane, Haruka was the first person in ages she could connect to and have fun with on her own terms, lacking the judgment of society. That said, Takane wasn't really injured, and her narcolepsy would never just go away, and so she was released from the hospital in time. Her bond with Haruka, though, was real, and she intended to keep up with him even after she left and Haruka would return to his home as well. Takane left her handheld devices with Haruka, letting it be both a symbol of their friendship as well as a reason to return. Even knowing that Takane would visit him, Haruka was depressed to have his only friend taken away, which is why Shintaro Kisaragi was a blessing. The long-term resident of the hospital wasn't strong. Takane spoke to him first, and when he was on his own, he had no self-confidence and was rather hopeless. But inspired by his friend, Haruka reached out to Shintaro, and the two began to kindle a bond of their own. Time passed, and Takane did in fact come to visit Haruka. However, she never actually greeted him. For when Takane saw the boy laughing alongside a stranger, having fun just as she once did, something stirred within her heart. Takane didn't know it, but she had fallen in love. Seeing Haruka laugh freely with Shintaro, though, made Takane think that she had been forgotten by Haruka, while she herself couldn't get him out of her head. Numerous times Takane would visit, but each time she would find Haruka together with Shintaro and wouldn't have the courage to speak to him. Shintaro and Haruka, though, talked a great deal. Shintaro told Haruka all sorts of stories about his life, and Haruka would listen intently. He told him when we dropped out of school, and Haruka thought it was a shame. Haruka, you see, was incapable of having a normal schooling even if he wanted to, which made the idea of going to school and meeting classmates all the more beautiful to him. Shintaro certainly didn't feel Haruka's enthusiasm, but was moved nonetheless by the passion of his sickly friend. To Shintaro and Haruka, their time together was priceless. Shintaro was granted a moment of reprieve from the chaos of his life, and Haruka got to continue the dream of normalcy that Takane gave him. Even so, like Takane, Shintaro couldn't stay forever. When he was in good enough condition, he returned to the Kisaragi home like anyone else, leaving Haruka once more. In all the time that he was with Shintaro, Haruka never once forgot about Takane. He didn't speak of her to Shintaro, but kept her in his heart the entire time, hoping that she would come back and fulfill her promise. Haruka kept many things from his friends. He, for instance, never really told them that he would never get better. He never told them that his problem was with his heart, and that it was unlikely he'd make it to adulthood. All of these silent worries, though, only made Shintaro and Takane all the more precious to Haruka. Shintaro returned home with a new lease on life. He decided that, at the very least, he would try to go to school once more. Haruka had convinced him that freedom and days spent with friends was paramount to none. With Shintaro's intellect, he was easily able to get into the local high school, and so he made his way to the hospital to tell Haruka the good news. Takane too had gone to the hospital that day. While she didn't know that Shintaro had been discharged, she was coming to check in on her friend that she lacked the courage to face. That very cruel day was none other than August 15th. That morning, Haruka Kokonose had gone into cardiac arrest and died on his hospital bed. Takane went into the visiting quarters to find Haruka absent. She did, however, find his sketchbook, which he often would doodle in. Therein, she finally realized just how foolish she had been. Many pages, and indeed the very last page ever put to pen, were filled with nothing else than portraits of her. Haruka, naturally, never forgot once about Takane. Consumed with a petty jealousy and self-doubt, she refused to see the person who had changed her life, and now he was gone forever, having died thinking that Takane had given up on him like everyone else. Consumed with grief, Takane navigated to the roof of the hospital and tried to take her own life, jumping off the building. Shintaro arrived at the hospital in a frenzy, soon learning that Haruka had died. Haruka and Takane were taken to the Eternal World, where they both had their wishes granted by the snakes. Haruka desired a stronger body, one that wouldn't fail him so he could live like a normal person, and Takane wished for a way to escape her body, which to her felt like nothing better than a prison. Haruka was gifted with awakening eyes, the ability to transform and strengthen your body, and Takane was gifted with opening eyes, the ability to project your spirit. However, these powers came at a cost. Haruka's mind was left behind in the Eternal World. When he woke, he had no memory and had taken the form of a character that Haruka once drew, which he named Konoha. Meanwhile, Takane's body was so crippled by her suicide attempt that she was put on life support in a permanent state of comatose. She could use her opening eyes to send her spirit out, manifesting itself through technology and the internet, but a spirit was all that she would be, for her body would never wake again. With the tragedy of the hospital trio, 2 more snakes were stolen and only 2 remained. Shintaro withdrew his application to the high school, and, rather than just dropping out of school, became a complete shut-in. For the first time in ages, he was moved by another and opened his heart, only to have everything stolen away from him. Momo tried to comfort her brother, who had always done so much to protect her. But Shintaro shut off his heart and pushed her away, driving a wedge between the Kisaragi siblings. Konoha, lost without any memories, wandered the streets alone until he was picked up on chance by a lonely girl who lost her family long ago. Takane, for her part, set out through the internet to try and find a reason to live. There, she discovered what had become of the boy she thought had taken Haruka from her. He was overcome with grief and depression, and completely separated from the world. He was so very much like her. But, in a way, all 3 of them were really similar the whole time. She thought about Haruka, what he wished and felt, and also about her own grief and guilt, and made a decision. Telling a kind lie, she navigated to Shintaro's computer and introduced herself as Ene, a conjugation of her name she used as an online handle. There, once more, 2 pained hearts connected as boy met girl. 2 years would pass, setting the stage for the story that would bind all of the children who stole the snakes from the Medusa. The only word for such a cruel and spiteful tale is tragedy. Shintaro Kisaragi had changed a lot over the years. His relationship to his sister had evaporated as she made a name for herself in the music industry as an idol. He and Takane developed a sort of antagonistic friendship. Ene would bug him and play pranks on him from within his computer, and the 2 would argue constantly. But it was clear to anyone that the 2 were close, in all reality. It was a summer's day in August, when one of Ene's pranks had gone a bit too far, causing Shintaro to spill some cola into the feed of his pet rabbit. Shintaro immediately freaked out and tried to purchase more feed online, but found that he couldn't get expedited shipping on any of his orders because of the Obon holiday. Shintaro cried out, realizing that his rabbit didn't have enough food to last that long, when Momo threw open his door, telling him that he was being too loud. This, however, gave Shintaro a wonderful idea. He asked Momo if she would go out and get the feed for him, which she promptly refused. While she did have shopping to do, there was no way in hell she was running her brother's errand for him. The 2 went back and forth until ultimately deciding that they would go out together. This was the first time that Shintaro Kisaragi had left the house since the death of Haruka. The siblings had become estranged over the years and bickered constantly when together, but going shopping together, both of them suffering under the late summer sun, just a tiny spark of their old bond was revitalized. Ene moved from Shintaro's computer to his cell phone, tagging along as well. Their time together as siblings was cut short, though, when they met 2 small children on the street. A glum boy, Amamiya Hibiya, and a commanding girl, Asahina Hiyori, found the duo by chance and approached. Hiyori, you see, was a huge fan of pop idol Momo Kisaragi, and even with her wearing common clothes and a hoodie, the child recognized her on sight and ran up. The 2 children were in the city to begin with visiting a relative of Hiyori's, who lived alone in spite of her young age. It was nothing short of providence that they met Momo Kisaragi that day. Having adjusted to being an idol and being a generally kind soul, Momo invited the 2 children to go shopping with them, and, much to the chagrin of Shintaro and Hibiya, the group made their way through town. Shintaro procured rabbit food, Momo bought some clothing, and Hibiya bought an accessory he intended to gift to Hiyori. The kind idol even gave Hiyori her own phone number, saying she was free to message her if she desired. Parting ways, Shintaro and Momo returned to their home, having closed the gap between them ever so slightly. When they arrived home, though, Momo realized that she had accidentally taken Hibiya's gift to Hiyori, and so quickly punched in Hiyori's number. When the line connected, though, Momo heard a deathly scream before the phone abruptly hung up. On that day, the 15th of August. The last 2 snakes would be released from the Eternal World. Hibiya and Hiyori were involved in a traffic accident after having left Shintaro and Momo, both having gone to the Eternal World. There, the world formed around them, trapping them both in an endless loop of watching the other die time and time again. Hiyori had a single wish within her, to find Hibiya and bring him back home. But each time she found him, he died. Hibiya just wanted to protect Hiyori, but was powerless to stop her from dying time and time again as well. Hiyori received the snake of focusing eyes, which gifted her with the power of clairvoyance, and Hibiya received the snake of clearing eyes, which would resist mortality with every ounce of its being. With this, every snake of the Medusa had been released from the Eternal World, and the clearing eyes would begin its plan to take over. Shintaro, Momo, and Ene ran off to find the missing children, splitting up to cover as much ground as possible. That said, they would soon discover that they weren't the only ones on the hunt. Shintaro stopped for soda, having tired himself out, only to discover none other than Kiro Tsubomi, who had grown into a teenager. After conversing for a moment, Shintaro discovered that, for some reason, Kido, Kano, and Seto were out looking for Hibiya and Hiyori as well. While Shintaro was conversing with Kido, Momo too encountered some familiar faces as she managed to find one of the 2 children. However, it wasn't as she would have desired. Momo finds Hibiya unconscious and being carried off by Kano and none other than Konoha, who the trio had discovered and realized was a holder of an eye power just like them. It was Konoha who was looking for the children to begin with when he met the trio and enlisted their help, for Konoha was staying at the same home as that lonely relative Hiyori was visiting. Momo demands they release him, suspecting that there's someone suspicious, but they refuse, stating that they're going to continue to look for Hiyori without offering Momo any other information. In a moment of desperation, Momo activates her drawing eyes, calling the attention of not only the boys, but a ton of bystanders who witnessed the strange scene. In the chaos, Hibiya wakes up and wriggles his way out of his captor's arms. Momo scoops him up and they make a break for it, leaving Konoha and Kano behind. Konoha's depressed that Hibiya escaped, but at least he's safe, while Kano smiles to himself, recognizing Momo's red eyes and having found at last yet another one of the ability holders. Shintaro and Ene part ways with Kido and encounter Momo running with Hibiya, the 4 of them retreating to the Kisaragi home to catch base. There, they try to calm down the panicking child, but he runs off on them again, insisting that he has to find Hiyori. Once more, the Kisaragi siblings give chase, realizing that whatever happened is something serious. Outside their home, Kano insists that they all work together, but after their first encounter, Momo isn't willing to listen to him and the siblings split up once more. While running and looking for Hiyori on his own, Hibiya is intercepted by a cold girl who had been moving behind the scenes. Ayano Tateyama finds the child alone. Recognizing the red in his eyes and realizing that, at last, the time for danger had arrived, she uses her favoring eyes on Hibiya, giving him some of Azami's memories so he can understand the gravity of the situation they're in. Ayano makes the incorrect assumption that Hibiya has the focusing eyes, and that the most dangerous snake, the one who started everything, the clearing eyes, must therefore be with her distant family member, Asahina Hiyori. What Ayano had deduced is the goal of the clearing eyes is that it wants freedom. The snakes of Azami naturally gather around the queen, which lives in Mary. Currently, all of Azami's powers are scattered across the children who stole them over time. But if they were to die, those snakes would naturally return to the queen. The Clearing Eyes wishes to do just that, to kill off the children and return all of the snakes to one place, where he would seize control of Mary's body and be born a new Medusa, but without the consciousness of either Azami or her granddaughter. As Ayano is trying to discern how they can find Hiyori, the duo is intercepted by Shintaro, who tries to level with Hibiya. Ayano tries to scare Shintaro off, knowing full well that he isn't one of the ability holders and therefore isn't related to this whole mess. Shintaro is persistent though, and the 3 of them end up reaching a peace as Ayano learns that Momo is the Drawing Eyes and that Shintaro is protecting his sister. Ideally, Ayano would have Hibiya use Focusing Eyes to find where Hiyori is, but she didn't realize that the boy actually has Clearing Eyes. Hibiya breaks off from the 2, intent to use his alleged Focusing Eyes, while Shintaro and Ayano head out together to continue the search. So begins the Clearing Eyes' plan. With nightfall, the Clearing Eyes can seize control of the body of its host. Taking control of Hibiya, the Clearing Eyes heads off to start executing the Eye Holders, as Ayano, his greatest threat, continues to operate under the false pretense that Hiyori is the one hosting him. Hibiya encounters Kido in the streets and kills her in a back alley, impaling her abdomen through unknown means before fleeing the scene. Hearing the struggle, Hiyori, who had been wandering the streets on her own this entire time looking for Hibiya, finds Kido covered in blood with Hibiya nowhere to be seen. With her final breath, Kido tells Hiyori to run away. Momo encounters Kano and Konoha once more, who try to calm her down and insist that they're all allies here. Momo is skeptical, but as Ene sees Konoha through her phone, who she immediately recognizes as being Haruka, she insists Momo chase after them. But while they wander, they too end up encountering Kido's corpse, Hiyori bloodied beside her. Kido runs to his dead sister in shock with Konoha, as Momo runs off to find Hibiya, now deathly concerned for his safety. Using the superior strength from his awakening eyes, Konoha takes Kito's body back to the apartment with the others as Kano interrogates Hiyori. Konoha presents Kito's corpse to Seto and Mary, who are overcome with grief, before setting out once more to stop any further tragedy from occurring. As the chaos ensues, Momo finds Hibiya once more, and he leads her to an abandoned building. At the same time, Shintaro hears his sister's voice, and he and Ayano give chase. Before they can make it to the top of the building, though, Shintaro finds his sister's phone on the ground. The phone rings, and as they examine it, Hiyori is on the other line, having explained the situation to Kano as the two were trying to contact Momo to warn her about Hibiya. But they were too late. Shintaro turns to see his sister falling out of the sky to her death, having been pushed off the roof by the clearing eyes snake. In a fit of rage, Ayano and Shintaro converge on the possessed Hibiya, as Hiyori uses focusing eyes to quickly locate the two with Kano in tow. Konoha jumps through the window of a nearby building with his superhuman strength, and at last, Haruka, Shintaro, and Takane are reunited. They corner Hibiya as Kano arrives with Hiyori, trapping the boy. Ayano tells him to give up, that there's nothing he can do against the five of them, but the clearing eyes disagrees, throwing himself willingly out of the window of the building. For even if he is their enemy, he's still in Hibiya's body. Konoha jumps after him, determined to protect the child, and catches him midair. He breaks the fall, severely injuring himself, but manages to keep Hibiya's body safe. With their strongest ally now injured, and the other four at the top of the building though, there's nothing to stop the clearing eyes from once more throwing Hibiya's body into oncoming traffic, forcing Konoha to bear the pain as his body reforms and leap to protect him. He is, however, too late to protect anything. Hibiya dies in the car wreck, but rather than returning to the queen, the clearing eyes transfers over to Konoha's body, usurping the awakening eyes and taking control of the consciousness just as he did for Hibiya. The rest of the kids make it down just in time to see Hibiya dead and Konoha possessed, as the clearing eyes escapes into the night, making final preparations before he kills the rest of the children. Shintaro and Ene return to their home, Momo and Hibiya dead, while the rest of the party goes back to the apartment that Kito, Kano, Seto, and Mary were living in. Shintaro is possessed with grief, and, with the help of Ene, starts doing everything he can to locate the clearing eyes. Hacking into a bunch of security cameras, Shintaro and Ene locate their enemy, and Shintaro storms off to face him, Ene pleading him to stop. Shintaro, however, doesn't care about the danger, and is possessed with rage. In order to try and stop her friend from marching to his death, though, Ene finally comes clean about her identity, and instead pleads with Shintaro to go to the hospital with her. There, Ene explains everything. She talks about how she knew Haruka and had seen Shintaro, how she lost everything because she was too petty and jealous. At last, she guides Shintaro into an old hospital room, where he sees her comatose body on life support. Ene tells Shintaro that he should value his life while he still has it. Value that freedom. Because even if Shintaro doesn't believe in himself and thinks himself a failure, his companionship saved Ene from her grief after she tried to take her own life. With Shintaro, Takane really got to be normal, to see a life and have happy memories just like any other person, even if she didn't have her body. Shintaro, realizing how foolish he'd been, how foolish he always was, breaks down in tears and tells Ene that she saved him too. It was only because she was there that he made it through those dark, horrible days. Finally at peace, Ene fades away to nothing, smiling in her final moments. The snakes, you see, exist to fill wishes. Well, in her final moments, Ene had nothing left to wish for. Shintaro had given her everything that she wanted out of life, and so Ene vanished, her snake returning to the queen. After a moment of peace for his most valuable friend, Shintaro leaves the hospital with a plan to fight back without throwing away his or anyone else's life. Meanwhile, everyone else was back at the apartment, trying their best to make it through. Losing Kito was enough for Ayano to sit down with her estranged siblings again, and for everyone to forgive. Everyone, of course, but Mary. Ever since the eye holder started dying, Mary went into a strange fever, her appearance changing into something a lot closer to Azami's. Indeed, Mary could feel the snakes returning to her. She could feel Kito, Momo, and Takane. She knew that they were dead and that all of this was her fault. If she never went out into the woods that day, she and her mother never would have died, and everyone never would have been caught up in that tragedy. As Mary curses herself, though, the spirits of Kito, Momo, and Takane reach out to her. No one blames the little queen for their fates. For pursuing a happy ending, finding and reaching out for love could never be a mistake. As everyone sits around hopelessly, Hiyori lashes out at the group, demanding that they pick themselves up and fight. In the midst of so much loss and tragedy, Hiyori having lost her friend, she refuses to give up on living. Inspired by the young girl, the kids start racking their brains for some way to get out of this mess that they're in. That's all just in time for a knock to arrive at their door. Ayano goes to answer it only to find Shintaro there. She tells him that he should run, that the clearing eyes won't kill him since he doesn't have a power. But much like Hiyori, he refuses to let people fight, die, and suffer right before him. Ene believed that Shintaro could help people, and so Shintaro too wants to believe that even if he couldn't help his sister, he might be able to save someone else from suffering. In particular, he thinks of Ayano, who just like him, grew apart from her siblings, the people that she loved most, only to have them violently taken away from her before having the chance to make amends. Shintaro rejects that pain and tells Ayano that he'll help her, so she doesn't need to keep suffering like him. Shintaro enters the home just in time for Mary to wake up, resolved to fight just the same as everyone else, and luckily, Shintaro Kisaragi has devised a plan. The gang retreat to Mary's home in the woods, and Shintaro gives everyone a few specific sets of instructions following learning about their powers. Using Takane's power, Mary projects herself onto a screen back at their apartment and uses Momo's power to draw the attention of the Clearing Eyes. Thinking he's found the group, he runs to the apartment only to find it empty. Mary taunts him to fight before combining Momo and Kito's powers. With Momo's eye ability, she makes the Clearing Eyes come to their real location into the forest. And with Kito's, she makes it so that he can't focus on anything else around him. With the Clearing Eyes in tow, so begins the game. The Clearing Eyes pursues everyone and finds Mary waiting for him. She tries to intimidate him, but he gives chase, promptly catching her. This, however, was all a trick. Mary melts away to reveal that it was Kano using his deceiving eyes to appear as Mary the whole time. While Kano was distracting the enemy, Ayano and Seto use their powers together. Seto draws all of the forest life together, and Ayano uses her favoring eyes to project onto the animals that the Clearing Eyes is a danger to life itself. Kano retreats and the Clearing Eyes is caught in a fall of rubble as the animals all attack. Everyone falls back to the house where Shintaro was waiting with the girls, thinking that at last victory had been achieved. But it was all in vain. Haruka's power, the Awakening Eyes, allows one to completely change the aspects of their body to be whatever they desire. Wishing for an unbreakable body, the Clearing Eyes becomes unstoppable and begins to break through the rubble. Shintaro orders everyone to retreat as the Clearing Eyes regains its freedom. With the Favoring Eyes, Kano asks that Ayano give him Azami's memories as well. She obliges and, armed with this knowledge, Kano runs off to buy them time, telling Shintaro that he leaves the rest of his family in his hands. Kano uses Deceiving Eyes to take Azami's appearance and speak to the Clearing Eyes. However, unlike before, their enemy doesn't fall for the trap. Kano, as Azami, insists that Azami's quest for self-identification, for peace forever with her family, was a wish that she never truly needed fulfilled, as the Clearing Eye snaps his neck, returning the Deceiving to the Queen. One by one, the remaining members of the group perish. Seto and Hiyori are murdered, leaving only Ayano, Mary, and Shintaro alive. The Clearing Eyes approaches, knowing that it's won the game, when Mary devises one final plan. At that point, Mary had all but 3 of the snakes returned to her. She was closer than anyone but Azami ever was to being a full Medusa, and so, with the power she has, she attempts to control the Queen Snake. Reaching out a hand, Mary issues a new order onto the eternal world for the first time since her own death, ordering the world to consume the Clearing Eyes. Through the deaths of her friends, and even strangers she would have liked to have known, Mary succeeded in sealing off the Clearing Eyes, the battle coming to a close. There, Mary and Ayano fell in grief. They survived, but the cost was far too much for them to pay. Never has there ever been a single life form more powerful than Azami. She could create powers at will to accomplish any desire that she ever had. And so, Mary, the next Medusa, manifested a desire of her own. Mary prays to turn back time itself. If the story ended in tragedy, then she would rewind the clock and let everyone try and fight their way out of destruction once more. For a world without everyone in it wasn't a world she wished to live in. Before Mary could reset the clock, though, Ayano makes a request of her sister. If time is reset and nothing else changed, then surely everyone would just repeat the same mistakes over and over again. And so Ayano makes a trade-off. The snakes and the Medusa gave them their lives back. The snakes saved them after they died and functioned as their life. And if a snake can function as a life, why then can't a life function as a snake? Ayano asks Mary to use her life to create a new snake. This snake would remember the tragedy of this world and use it to create a better one in the next cycle. The person who should receive such a power being none other than the one who most earnestly wanted everyone to live, who reached out a hand and said that he would save her. Mary agrees and turns Ayano into a new snake, the snake of retaining eyes, which is given to Shintaro Kisaragi to take forward into the new world. Mary and Shintaro make a pact to do better in the next life, and Mary takes the favoring eyes from her sister and resets time. Time flows back, and even though Shintaro Kisaragi is the one to receive retaining eyes, everyone learns just a little from the world that came before. In this new world, many of the first events happen as they did before. Azami loses herself, retreating into the eternal world. Mary is born and loses her life alongside her mother on August 15th, receiving the Queen Snake. Indeed, the children all fall upon tragedy, and many of the snakes in the Medusa are stolen. But something has changed in Seto Kosuke. Something that internally results in the child knowing, on some deep level, that he should not bring Mary home with him when he finds her in the woods that day. Instead, in this new world, Seto befriends Mary and visits her, but she never goes to live with the Tatayamas, and therefore Kenjiro and Ayaka never meet her. Still though, causality can only be shifted so much. Events will naturally attempt to flow into one another, and still, Kenjiro and Ayaka are caught up in a landslide years later that takes their life. That said, Ayano isn't with them because they were not going to see Mary's home, and therefore the young girl doesn't receive favoring eyes. Instead, the timeline deviates once again, as none other than Kenjiro Tateyama leaves the eternal world with an eye power. What Kenjiro wanted, more than anything, was to see his wife again, to reject that mortality. To reunite with a lost one, to reject death as a universal usurper, Kenjiro, right from the story's start, adopts the snake of clearing eyes. The Tateyama household grieves the loss of their mother, but Ayano never fights with their siblings, so they all stay at home. Though they've been hurt, they at least have each other, and the clearing eyes can't take action until all of the snakes are stolen from the Medusa, which will not occur yet for many years. Here, the events start to change even more. With Ayano Tateyama, Shinjiro Kisaragi, Haruka Kokonose, and Takane Enomoto, there's a shift to how they think that's reflective of what happened in the previous world. They were all truly lonely people, who learned how wonderful it was to have companions. They learned how much they all liked and could rely on one another. And so, when Ayano and Shinjiro are in middle school, Ayano approaches Shinjiro and the two of them become friends, remembering somewhere, deep down, that they always were. To the distant Shinjiro, Ayano is like the sun, and to the struggling Ayano, Shinjiro gives her strength. That alone isn't all that changes though. Haruka and Takane remember the joy of their bonds, and decide that they too won't just sit idle in this world, and they go to school, where they're both taught together in special education because of Haruka's heart condition and Takane's narcolepsy, the special education teacher being none other than Kenjiro Tateyama. Like clockwork, Shinjiro and Ayano graduate middle school and end up in the same high school as Haruka and Takane, and the four become fast friends with one another, holding on to that spark from their previous lives. To those four children, nothing was more valuable than the bond they shared between them. Shinjiro and Takane fought constantly, but only because they were so fundamentally similar. Haruka encouraged his two gloomy friends, even getting the straight-laced Shinjiro hooked on cola, and Ayano smiled and supported everyone, giving Takane her first real female friend, and forming bonds that would last everyone a lifetime. That said, Ayano was beginning to suspect that something was wrong. Untouched by Azami's memories, Ayano was still the pure and kind girl that her siblings grew up with. Her father, occasionally in the dead of night, would act strangely, and in time she discovered the disturbing notes left behind by the clearing eyes in his study. There, Ayano learned just a bit about the Medusa that her parents once studied and of the ability holders. Furthermore, she realizes that her father isn't at all who he claims to be, and that he's targeting her friends, Haruka and Takane. Enlisting Kano's help, Ayano starts to do some snooping around. Ayano has her younger brother use her power to take on her appearance and go to school in her place as she investigates the Medusa and her father on her own. Kano does his best not to blow his cover, and in the process comes to meet Shinjiro, Haruka, and Takane. Ayano doesn't tell her brother her findings, but learns that the Clearing Eyes, once again, is trying to rebuild the Medusa, and that doing so means that not only Haruka and Takane, but all of her younger siblings were in grave danger. This all coincides with the arrival of a fate no one could ever change. No amount of personal growth could ever stop Haruka's heart from killing him. But this time, he doesn't take his feelings to the grave. All of his friends, as well as Mr. Tateyama, know about his disease, and in Haruka's final days, he even opens up to Shinjiro about how scared he is of dying. To the boy who only ever wanted friends, Shinjiro, Takane, and Ayano were invaluable to him. But friendship can't heal wounds, and on August 15th, Haruka Kokonose dies, just as he did before. However, this time the Clearing Eyes begins to put gears into motion. Knowing that he needs to pry more snakes out of the Eternal World, the Clearing Eyes uses Kenjiro's body to poison Takane Enomoto, killing her as well. Haruka and Takane both end up going to the world and getting the same snakes as they once did. But unlike before, Takane's body isn't mailed and on life support. However, it is placed into a state of forced comatose by the Clearing Eyes. Ayano realizes it's too late to stop her father from hurting her friends. But even so, she puts into motion a plan of her own. The Clearing Eyes wishes to unify the snakes into a new Medusa. Ayano couldn't save her friends anymore, but she thinks of a way to potentially save her siblings, for the Medusa can't reform if it doesn't have all of the powers. On that same August 15th that Haruka and Takane died, Ayano commits suicide, jumping off the roof of her school. Suspecting that something wasn't right, Kano follows Ayano to school, but it's too late to stop her from killing herself. Ayano goes to the Eternal World and receives her power, the Favoring Eyes, just as she did before. But this time she refuses to leave the Eternal World. Ayano stays in Azami's world and holds her snake hostage, for no one can take it from her, and if she never returns to life, then the Clearing Eyes cannot reform the Medusa. This does indeed throw a wrench into the Clearing Eyes' plan. However, it thinks of a workaround. Finding Kano screaming at his sister's death, the Clearing Eyes beats him and forces him to go pretend to be Ayano's dead body, for no one who goes to the Eternal World leaves behind a corpse. The Clearing Eyes can simply kill everyone but Ayano if it must, and then either force open the Eternal World or simply have Mary reset time and start the entire cycle over once more. Kano does as he's told and pretends to be Ayano's corpse, long enough for someone to discover it, after which he leaves the scene, now a forced assistant to the Clearing Eyes. On his way back, he encounters Shintaro, who has not yet realized that all of his friends are dead. In a fit of rage, Kano takes the form of Ayano once more and blames the entire situation on Shintaro for never realizing the pain his sister was in, before storming off. As far as Shintaro Kisaragi knew, those were the last words his best friend ever told him before killing herself. Indeed, Shintaro soon discovered that not just Haruka this time, but each and every one of his friends all died on the very same day. Haruka's heart attack, Takane's sudden organ failure, and Ayano's suicide were far too much for the boy to handle at once, and, just like the previous timeline, he drops out of school and becomes a shut-in. Ayano's suicide shakes the Tateyama family. Ayano was kind and beloved by all, especially her siblings, who saw her as nothing short of a hero. Seto could read minds, but never realized the pain his sister was in. Kido lost a sister already, and still she opened her heart to Ayano, only to lose her too. And Kano was forced to keep smiling, pretending that he didn't know everything, and still did nothing. Shortly thereafter, the children move out of the Tateyama home and into their own apartment, just as they did before, leaving Kenjiro alone without his wife or any of his children. There, they invite Mary out of the woods to live with them, where she stays permanently thereafter. Once more, Shintaro was divided from Momo, and once more, Takane finds her way over to him. But unlike the previous world, Shintaro's grief is vast and encompasses the perceived loss of her as well. Takane tries to interact with Shintaro, but he's far more despondent than in the last world, as his wounds are far deeper. And after 2 years of solitude, Shintaro makes the worst decision. On the anniversary of their deaths, Shintaro deletes NA from his computer before locking the door and taking his own life. Mary sought to make the world better by resetting time, but nothing even close to that was ever achieved. Shintaro, the one who was supposed to save everyone, never realized he had an eye power, fell into a horrible spiral of depression, and ultimately refused all of his support lines before killing himself. One by one, the Clearing Eyes acted just as it did before, killing the survivors and cornering Mary, before the Queen once more resets the world, sending the group into a perilous cycle. We do not know just how many times this happened. Time and time again, the children were put through the grinder, learning small lessons, but never enough to topple their fate. Takane, for instance, learned that Shintaro would fall into a deep and inescapable depression after all of the school friends died, and so, just as Ayano had once told her, she becomes selfish and persistent, doing everything in her power to help Shintaro back onto his feet so that horrible world never comes again. And indeed, never again does Shintaro Kisaragi kill himself. That, however, hardly means that they're safe. In the end, the Clearing Eyes is a nigh unstoppable foe, and without Shintaro able to recall that he even has retaining eyes, there's little hope for big change. That said, the world keeps resetting, as it always does. This time, things happen as they did before, but Shintaro never kills himself. He's still suffering, but his depression is more akin to how it was in the first timeline, painful but manageable with NA's help. He's still a shut-in, but he hasn't completely given up on life. Much like the inciting moments of the first timeline, Shintaro spills his cola as a result of one of NA's pranks. But this time it falls onto his keyboard, and he's once again unable to get a new one because of Obon. However, this time he can't even try to have Momo get him a new one because Momo isn't home. Left with no other option, Shintaro breaks his 2-year isolation and goes with NA to the mall to gain a new keyboard. While Shintaro was out for the first time, Momo was having a bit of a crisis of her own. Having wandered around town, she catches the eye of a crowd of people and is forced to run away, unable to consistently control her drawing eyes. There, she ends up meeting Kido, who invites her up to their apartment on account of discovering her eye ability. In this timeline, Momo actually ends up joining the mekakushidaan, the old name Ayano gave for her siblings, as its 5th member, Mary IV. After some hijinks, she ends up befriending the quiet but kind Kido and the skittish and unknowing Mary, with the smart-ass Kano joining them as well as the group heads to the mall to buy some replacement dishes after Mary breaks them. As both parties arrive at the mall though, they find it suddenly overcome by a group of terrorists who occupy the mall, demanding a government ransom. Shintaro ends up meeting Kano, and with the cooperation of the mekakushidaan and Shintaro and NA, they're able to use their eye powers to outwit the criminals and free the hostages. Kido uses her concealing eyes to sneak around and make distractions, while Momo and Mary work together to subdue the criminals. Shintaro and NA take advantage of the chaos they cause to have NA deactivate the security systems the terrorists were using to take the hostages, and let everyone go free. Together, the group successfully saves the day, but Shintaro passes out from the excitement and awakes in the group's apartment, where everyone introduces themselves before indoctrinating Ene and Shintaro into the mekakushidaan as the 6th and 7th members, respectively. Shintaro learns that these people have similar afflictions to his sister, and agrees to help them out on the pretense that they help her live a more normal life. Celebrating their newfound friendship, and mostly at Ene's behest, the group goes to the amusement park to celebrate their victory. Seto Kosuke, now off work, joining them all as well. Together, the group has a lot of fun. Shintaro, Kido, and Mary bond over being easily scared, while Ene and Kano team up to tease the others. Furthermore, this lets Shintaro and Momo begin to reconnect with each other once more. They have a fun and tiring time before making their leave, where they encounter something strange. Standing near the exit with a bunch of commotion around them is a tall man and a young boy. Here, the group encounters Konoha and Hibiya. In this timeline, Hibiya and Hiyori were once again involved in the traffic accident, but unlike before, Hibiya is the one to get focusing eyes, while Hiyori stays behind in the eternal world. The two groups join together, Ene recognizing Konoha as one of Haruka's old drawings, and Hibiya and Konoha become the last 2 members of the mekakushidaan, 8 and 9. Having gathered so many of the ability holders together, and indeed, all but Ayano and the Clearing Eyes are present, the group begins to try and solve the many mysteries concerning themselves, their powers, and the world itself. Hibiya is still shaken from the loss of Hiyori, and Momo takes him around town to try and calm him down. While this occurs, the rest of the Dawn have a chat, confirming a lot about each other's pasts and the links between them, namely, of course, how they all have died. Deciding that they should pursue information about their powers, Shintaro, Konoha, Kido, and Mary head out to Mary's old home in the forest in pursuit of any information that Azami may have left behind. After some time, and much to the exhaustion of everyone but Konoha, the group arrives and they find a diary Azami wrote a long time ago. Reading the notes together, they learn about the eye powers, they learn about the tragedy of the Medusa, and they learn about the other world, where everyone they lost is still trapped. Together, they decide that they're going to try and fight fate and take back their loved ones from the eternal world of the first Medusa. Kido creates a name for this other world, the Kagerou Days, and together with Shintaro, Operation Conquer the Kagerou Days is born. The 4 of them head back to the apartment to share their findings with the others and begin to fight their fate. On their way back, though, Shintaro fell from a cliffside and almost suffered horrible injuries. However, Konoha leapt to save him at the last minute, using his awakening eyes to power himself up and heal his injuries thereafter. Shintaro thanked Konoha and the 2 of them share a coke. Shintaro briefly reminded of his late best friend, Haruka Kokunose. While this was occurring, Kano went off on his own. As the group got ever closer to the truth, they got ever closer to realizing that Kano had been forced to work against them. Only Kano had interacted with the Clearing Eyes snake directly, as it forced him to be Ayano's dead body, as well as perform numerous other tasks as the Deceiving Eyes over the years. As the boy was stressing over this all alone, he is interrupted by Seto, who can tell that Kano's tense and demands he talk to him. Kano's reluctant to say anything, scared of the coming future where they'll be hunted and killed, but Seto undoes him with kindness and love, assuring him that whatever they face, they'll find a way through. After all, they have so many new friends, and most important of all, Seto and Kano are brothers, so he would never give up on him. Using his stealing eyes, Seto parsed through Kano's mind, understanding the burden his brother carried and the danger they were in. Even so, the boys resolved to do everything they could to fight back. Kano had spent enough time with the Clearing Eyes that he'd become privy to many of his plans and preparations. Kano returned to base and retrieved Ene from Momo, and together they went to the school. Hidden underneath it, Kano knew Takane's body was being preserved. Sneaking their way through, Kano restored Takane to her body, letting her once more move around freely, not as Ene the cyber girl, but as Takane Enomoto. They returned to base alongside Shintaro and the gang, and everyone had a meeting about what to do next. Naturally, Shintaro was more than a little disturbed by the girl on his computer actually being his dead friend Takane, and Konoha somehow being Haruka, but he did his best to take those things in stride, as he and Takane thanked each other for their company over the years. With Shintaro and Kido strategizing, and with Kano's insight, the group realized the danger they were in and devised a plan to stop the Clearing Eyes. Momo would create a diversion, with Takane and Hibiya as scouts. The rest of the Dawn would corner the Clearing Eyes in the school and subdue it with Konoha. That was how the plan was supposed to go. However, what they didn't anticipate was that the Clearing Eyes was capable of possessing bodies. Just as it always did, their enemy possessed Konoha, their strongest ally, and began to massacre the children. Shintaro and Kido were the first to fall, facing their enemy head-on without any fear. The diversion complete, Momo joined the group just as the carnage was unfolding. The Clearing Eyes lashed out against everyone, but before it could take another life, it was momentarily stopped by a surprise actor. Moving through Mary's body, Azami Kozakura took control and froze the Clearing Eyes in place with their powers. All throughout her life, Azami was a coward, someone who ran from the darkness of the world. But seeing all the members of the mekakushidaan band together to fight the monster she created, she moved through the Queen Snake and Mary and decided that she would right the wrongs of the past. Immediately, Azami tried to nullify the Clearing Eyes, but without her full abilities as Medusa, she wasn't able to control the powers within the children. Azami knew that there was no beating the awakening eyes physically, but she did think of an alternative, painful though it may be. The only way for everyone to beat the clearing eyes as is was for them to willingly recreate the scenario from the first timeline. If enough people gave up their lives so Mary could manifest the power of the Medusa, then she could swallow their foe and let everyone else live. It was only a matter of choosing the survivors. While the plan was certainly cruel, they knew it was the only way for anyone to make it out alive. Momo and Kano were the first to give up their lives. Both of them watched as Shintaro and Kido, their family members, who were so easily frightened and had seen so much pain throughout their lives, faced the clearing eyes without hesitation. They understood the power of that moment and the love they displayed, and so, they too would be brave. Perhaps Kano was never truly honest with Kido, and perhaps Momo had lost the bond she had with Shintaro, but there was no doubt still a connection that they valued between them. If those two could be brave, so too would they. While their allies were fighting, Takane was watching the whole thing from security cameras with her opening eyes. She watched Momo and Kano step up without fear and offer themselves for the future. Hibiya too bore witness with his focusing eyes. He had seen so much death in such a short period of time. Looking down at the boy, Takane saw herself. She saw Shintaro, just another kid who wanted a place to belong, and yet was denied it time and time again. Takane made a choice, told Hibiya that everything would be fine, and ran down to where the others were, offering herself to Azami as well. With those 3 sacrifices, Azami was able to open the Kagerou days and seal away the clearing eyes, leaving Mary, Seto, and Hibiya left alone as survivors. After Azami returned her granddaughter's body to her, Mary had lost a good chunk of her memories. She was functioning happily and she didn't realize that she had lost nearly all of her friends. Together, Seto and Hibiya took her out of the school and back home, where Seto would take care of her, never allowing himself a moment to heal from the pain of watching everyone die. In time, Mary's memories returned to her and she learned to deal with the pain. The one who was truly suffering was Seto, who reverted to fearing the world once more. One summer's day, when the tragedy was gone and past, Mary embraced Seto, thanking him for everything he'd done and always did to take care of her, and told him that it was fine for him to hurt too, that thanks to him, she got to truly love that cruel yet beautiful world. All, however, was not yet lost. Hibiya, in time, practicing with his focusing eyes, was able to see not just over the world, but into the Kagerou days itself. Everyone had died on August 15th, so even though they lost their lives, in all reality they had simply gone back into the Kagerou days, just as they'd done as children. Channeling his power into his phone, Hibiya devised a way to call and communicate with the friends they lost along the way. And not just them either. Seto, Mary, and Hibiya all huddled around a phone, where on the other end were not just the fallen members of the mekakushidaan, but Kido's older sister Rin, the Tateyama parents, Hiyori, and everyone else that was lost to the Kagerou days. Though they're a world apart, they're still doing their best. Everyone has an emotional moment where they get to reconnect with their lost friends before making a final resolution. They will reset the world one more time. They went through a lot and gained a lot in turn. As people, they overcame their weakness and learned to stand together as friends. Surely, internalizing these lessons, they would truly win next time. Shintaro walks with Ayano within the Kagerou days. They talk for a moment, and Shintaro swears that they'll do better. And so begins the final chapter of the narrative. Time resets and everything goes much as it did before. Shintaro goes out to get a keyboard and meets the mekakushidaan. They go out to the amusement park and end up meeting Konoha and Hibiya, all as before. But this time, a large portion of the gang goes out to visit a grave afterwards. Shintaro and Mary stay behind as most of the rest of the group goes off to visit the grave of Ayano Tateyama, for the date is August 15th, the anniversary of her death. Annie is surprised to see that so many people know her old friend, as the group realizes they're a lot more connected than they first thought. While the others do that, Shintaro meanwhile goes to check on the sleeping Mary, tired out from their day at the park. He finds her resting well in Seto's room, but beside her, he sees something strange. Framed next to Mary is a picture of Kido, Kano, and Seto as kids. However, there's another person in frame as well. Standing behind the 3 ability holders is their older sister, Ayano Tateyama. Shintaro knew that Ayano had siblings, but he had never met them, and certainly didn't know that they were the same people he was now friends with himself. This should have been wildly shocking to the boy. But it wasn't. For some reason, Shintaro found this all vaguely familiar, and so finally was a trigger met that allowed him to recall the promise he made with Mary and Ayano so long ago. Seeing that picture frame, Shintaro Kisaragi remembers the retaining eyes. Activating his power, all of Shintaro's memories, caught through each and every failed timeline, come back to him in an instant. He realizes the danger they're all in, but more importantly, through all the hell he'd seen with all those people at his side, with everything he learned about them and about the world, he creates a plan. Shintaro Kisaragi kills himself, going willingly into the Kagerou days. There he meets up with Haruka, who he finally gives peace to, as well as Ayano, who he reassures with kindness. They will both be vital to the plan. While Shintaro is doing his preparations in the Kagerou days, the rest of the group gets cornered by the Clearing Eyes at the school. They engage him, but he takes over Konoha's body just as he always does. However, before he can actually kill anyone, the Kagerou days opens behind him as Shintaro and Ayano step out side by side. Ayano Tateyama always could have left the Kagerou days, but she refused to in order to safeguard the Favoring Eyes. However, she wasn't anticipating Mary reset in time, making her sacrifice meaningless. With Ayano free, Shintaro gives her a very specific set of instructions, which she then forwards to Mary using the power of Favoring Eyes. Ayano transfers Shintaro's plan to Mary, and she collects the snakes from everyone, just as she did in the previous timeline. However, rather than taking just the Clearing Eyes into the Kagerou days, she takes everyone into the days all at once. Though perhaps more powerful than average, the Clearing Eyes is still bound to the same rules as the other snakes of the Medusa. It exists for the purpose of fulfilling wishes. It had been functioning off of Kenjiro's desire to see his wife again, manipulating and drawing out that process so it could fulfill its own goals. However, in the Kagerou days, Kenjiro is readily able to reunite with Ayaka, and therefore his wish is fulfilled. Left without his master, the Clearing Eyes is forced to follow the wish of the body that he's currently in. That's where Haruka Kokonose comes in. Haruka's wish is for the Clearing Eyes to passively become the life force for Hiyori, and though the Clearing Eyes tries to reject that, he is unable to disregard his master's wish. The Clearing Eyes leaves Konoha and enters Hiyori, where it will remain inactive. Mary returns the snakes to their holders, allowing all of the mekakushidaan members and Hiyori to leave the days and return once more to the world of the living. This, of course, means that they're going to have to say goodbye to the days. The family members they lost will remain in that eternal world. But they all accept that. That is, after all, the true nature of life and death. Even with that loss, Hibiya could still use focusing eyes to communicate between the worlds if need be. The mekakushidaan says goodbye to the people they loved and lost, before leaving the world to a new day, beyond August 15th. Shintaro and Ayano meet on a sunny day, ready to go off and join the rest of the mekakushidaan. When they met, they were enemies. At the end of the first story, though, they learned to care for one another. Truthfully, Ayano fell in love, and Shintaro carried her with him for all the rest of his life. It was Ayano that became the retaining eyes, and it is Ayano that keeps his heart beating, even so. The two were estranged. Her suicide broke Shintaro many times, but they kept getting back up again and again until their bond could bring about a miracle. The two of them go out to meet the rest of their friends, happy at last. And thus, boy met girl once more.